Chris, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Hey everybody, this is Dr. William Clark here for Leadership Conversations. This is a show where we talk about leadership according to the world that matters to you. And on this show, we typically talk about leadership within the realm of nonprofits and churches. And so today, it's one of those conversations where we talk about leadership within the church, but from a lens that's a little different than normal. And we're going to be talking about church planting. Got my friend Chris Skowronek here. How are you, Chris?
Good.
Did I pronounce your last name right?
Skowronek. Close.
Sorry.
That's fine.
And this is a conversation that we wanted to have because, you and I met a year and a half ago due to your new role, and we'll talk about that. Mm-hmm. And, we met because of church planting. And, when we decided to do this podcast, it was about, let's talk about church planting. But then the other day when we were together, there was a statement I made in terms of just talking about church planting from a regular person's point of view, right? Because church planting is not this glorified experience that we all believed it would be when we first started and decided to accept the call of God. So, this conversation is going to be just about planting, about your work in New England, how you assist people with planting in the process, etc. That sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. So as we get started, Chris, tell us a little bit about you, your story here in Connecticut, and what you've been up to that led you to your role now.
Okay. Basically, for me, ministry is second career. So I started in insurance, but kind of always knew for probably since I was little, that I was going to be involved in ministry somehow, and grew up in a family that had faith and went to church. And when I got to college, got involved with a ministry on campus called Campus Crusade for Christ, now Cru. And when we talked about, as I got involved with the ministry, it really kind of stirred something in me. God used it to make me think ministry is where he wanted me. I just didn't know where it was. And so out of college, got married and jumped into a church. I grew up Catholic, so I didn't really have any other church background other than that's the only church I knew.
Right.
And so as we got married, we found a church. We had friends going to a church. Lo and behold, it was a church plant, which I'd never even heard of church planting before. So it was just a small church. I knew it was a new church. And we were there for quite a long time, and we got involved, and we became leaders in the church. And but the church had some things that it struggled through. I think a lot of it was a leadership issue where it was the second pastor into the plant, and the first pastor was a planter who kind of looks at life differently. Planters look at life. How do I reach the next person? How do I take this church to the next place? How do I look at my community? It's way more missional, and sometimes a pastor who's been in ministry for a while at a church functions more like a chaplain. So they're kind of just keeping the whole ship going.
Managing.
But they're not thinking about how do we go forward? How do we reach the community? And so I think that was the problem the church ran into. And so the second pastor was more of a chaplain and theologian. And so it just didn't help that church in its early years actually move forward and continue to be a church plant and grow and become stable. And so we were there for, quite a while, I guess 6 or 7 years. And the church just had a lot of struggles, and so we had decided to leave, and we were going to pursue ministry, but just do it differently, go to seminary, do all of that. And so anyway, we just got a call out of the blue after we had left that church from the denomination. They had some leaders here the church had gotten to the point where it was basically going to close. There wasn't really anybody left, and it didn't have any property. And so they just said, well, hey, can we talk to you and find your perspective on what happened? Pastor had resigned, leadership team was gone. I said, yeah, I'd be glad to. And next thing I know, they were asking me, would you consider taking this small group and making it a church again and taking it forward? I said, well, maybe. I wasn't sure because I'd never been through that process before. And so they took me through assessment and all that church planters typically go through to see if they're qualified. And, basically they felt I could do it, but I had no experience. But I had a real heart and a passion for the people and the community, and I'd grown up here, so I knew the people. And the two pastors before with this group had come from the Midwest, and so their perspective of life is just different than growing up around here. And so we answered that call part-time, we did that for a couple of years, and then God opened up the opportunity for me to leave my job, full-time job, and to go full-time at the church. And so we did that for 6 or 7 years. The only thing was, we didn't know much about church planting, and although I was taking theology classes and a lot of that's required, to be in ministry that I didn't have, I didn't know exactly how to do church planting here, and there weren't a lot of good examples here. That was 21 years ago. And so most of the guys that I saw plant churches when I started all didn't stay with it long, like 2-3 years, and they all left. So I knew they weren't good examples to follow. And so a lot of the voices speaking to me were guys from the Midwest, because that's where we were connected. And so they knew how church worked there, but they didn't really know how church works in New England. And it's just different.
It's different, man.
It's very different. And so we ended up at some point just kind of realizing that we can't keep what was going, just moving it forward, just kind of keeping it going and trying to somehow make that work. We just needed to start all over again, just from scratch. Because really, when we started, the advice we got was just take what you had, take the name, take the vision, take everything, and just work harder at it. The problem was, it wasn't a model that was really sustainable here. And so we really had to scrap the whole thing and start all over again. Yeah. And so that's what we did in 2006. And we did that for 10 years. And so with ups and downs, as you're kind of taking a group that you're kind of closing one church and reopening in a new location with everything new, there are struggles that come along with that. But it was a good run. But we felt for a while that God had been calling us to something else. And so we, quite by chance, although we had tried many times to plant churches, 3 times prior, God brought a church planter into our church who had come here from California and said he wanted to plant a church. And so somebody had given him advice that they were planting kind of near to us, 5 or 6 miles from us, and said you should go to a local church, spend a year there, get to know the people, because he had just come from California with his family here, and just get yourself settled in and then plant your church. And so he landed in our church. And so in his process of planting the churches, I got connected into what was the North American Mission Board and Southern Baptist Church, and so which we weren't. And I was so impressed by the people and the things that they were doing, and knew that that's where God had pushed me. And matter of fact, at some point, my wife said, I think this is what God has been grooming you for all these 20 years. I was like, okay, that's good. It's good enough for me. That's enough. So that's how I really got involved. But I had always been a friend to church planters because I felt like kinship there, because I know you just look at life different, than somebody, say, in an established church that maybe calls a pastor that has ministry experience. It's just a different perspective on life. Yeah. And so I'd spent a lot of time trying to encourage pastors and serving on the mission board for our denomination, it's mostly in the Midwest. So I'd be involved in church plants, but they were all in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana. Yeah. It wasn't here in Connecticut. So
that's an interesting story. I mean, I will tell you, the North American Mission Board, at least the team here that I've met, have been people that have been friends to me. And I think when I was going through my transition coming to Connecticut, figuring out what my calling looks like here, it was NAM that showed the type of love and support that I needed. Because as you alluded to, and we'll talk about this too, planting in New England is different than any other place in the country. And I think, for those of us who have made the trek from our birthplaces to another place, particularly New England in this context, it's easy to have this grandiose perspective about what planting is going to look like and how you're going to just, shake New England for Jesus, right? Or shake your new territory for Jesus. And then you come to realize there's a culture here. It's just like any other place. But I think that gets taken for granted because, where you live, where you work, where you exist prior to following God's call, you become normalized to that community. And you can research any and everything you can about this new territory you're going to. But it's nothing like getting here and spending quality time here to understand what that data actually means, in a practical sense. So that's been interesting. So before we get further into our conversation topics, I want to go off a little bit because you talked about your history coming from other parts of the country. In your mind, what's different about planting in New England versus in other parts of the country, or pastoring in New England versus other parts of the country?
I think there's probably two big things. One, most people here are Catholic, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It's just reality. And so you kind of, having grown up that way, you have this perspective on church that it's there when you need it. You go because you're told you have to go. There's an obligation to go. And it's not a place where you go and you learn and you grow. It's a place you go because it's what you're supposed to do. And so the perspective is different. There's no engagement in part of a community. Nobody goes to church because they want to hear a sermon or they want to learn about their faith. They're just going because they have to go. That's kind of the way we're all kind of raised that way. And it's, typical mass is 30 minutes. And so as Protestants, we have, hour and a half services. People come for 2 hours. That's a big change for them.
Pentecostals multiply that by 2 or 3.
And so you have that one piece of it. That so just what people think of when they think of church is not at all what, like the typical evangelical Protestant from somewhere else thinks of as church. And because it's the dominant group here, most people are coming out of that as opposed to coming out of another church. Maybe they grew up in church and they know what church was like. It's the hours, the 2 hours, it's whatever it is. And people just don't do potlucks and Bible studies. And it's just all of that is new experience for people.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing here is that there's just a lot of people. I mean, there's pockets where obviously there's tremendous, people struggle financially, but, the suburbs around here, typically people are pretty well off. They're well educated. Their need for God is just different. Like their perspective of, I'll go to church when I need to go to a wedding or a funeral or baptism. And then besides that, it's very different. And from a giving perspective, the thought of someone giving 10%, say a tithe, which a new church needs people to give. People who typically, my experience anyway, growing up Catholic, you just give a few dollars into the offering. But there's so many people that it works, But in a small church or in a church plant, you're asking people to go from giving nothing to a percentage of their income, which is just like beyond belief. So I think you have those struggles that you don't even really. It's a whole culture you have to break through.
Yeah. I mean, that's so interesting. I love what you said. You said the need for God is different here. And I think that's probably a lesson that all planters learn, in most cases, the hard way. How you grow up in the city and town you grow up in, the state you grow up in, and how God is needed there isn't necessarily the same as how God is needed in the new place. I think of New England as, like you said, well off, pretty well educated. There are a number of Ivy League institutions located in the New England region, right? So there's, a high level of intellect here. That changes things and changes how the gospel is presented. I mean, whether you're talking about the dominant white culture here or versus the minority cultures that are represented here, it's just different. And how you acclimate, how you adjust as a pastor, planter, and deliver the gospel. So, one of the things you mentioned earlier too, and I think, this comment you made is such a New England comment too, but you said you think pastors, existing pastors think like chaplains or managers, and the planter thinks like a leader or entrepreneur. Say more about that from the context of where you've seen it, how it plays out, particularly here in New England, and what are the key differences there as you see it?
Well, say like a typical church that's been around for a while, the leadership, it's typically like, how do I describe it? The churches around here, so they're typically led by an elder board, of which the pastor is one board member. He may have a strong voice, but he's not necessarily the dominant voice. And so as a church planter, you have to make a decision right up front. What is the polity of your church going to be? Who's going to really run this church? And so if you're going to be the leader and you're going to have a team that's supporting you and encouraging you and watching your back and, making sure, they're there if you're having issues, that's a particular perspective. But the existing church, the pastor typically doesn't function that way unless they planted it, which is rare. And so that pastor comes in, he's been hired by a church. They see him as serving a particular function for them. So it's kind of like an employer-employee perspective. But if, as a planter, you really have to come in as an entrepreneurial thinking and say, this is where I'm going. I'm going to lead this ship, and I'm going to carry it through certain stages and phases of growth.
Right.
And so you really have to, and that was something I wasn't prepared for. Even now I'm reading a book by, I think it's Eric Liddell on entrepreneurial leadership, and realizing how much it's connected to the church and how sometimes we fail as church planters because we don't understand anything about running an organization or budgeting, or we know the few things that they teach us in seminary, but it's not really helpful when you're really running a church. It's not business related.
Right.
And there's a business part of church that, planters come in with a lot of passion.
A lot of heart.
A lot of heart.
A lot of theology.
And a lot of, ideology of this is going to be incredible. It's going to be awesome.
Yes.
And then you start dealing with budgets and problems and businesses and schools and politics, and you're just not prepared for it.
No, and I've always felt that about seminary, that it's great in teaching me elements of church history, theology, but where are the leadership courses? I mean, the hardcore leadership courses. Where are the courses around business? Right. And I've heard this, since being a part of NAM, that the best way to reach the lost is the planting of new churches. Mm-hmm. If that's true, which I believe it is, and obviously you do too, then where is the instruction on how to run a startup business? Because that's what the church plant is. Right. There's the part where, as we were talking about this week, you're doing the preaching and the worshiping and everything else, but then there's the paying of bills. I mean, we're, on the campus of Living Faith, third location, right? And one of the things that I said to the group when I first moved in here was, "Oh man, I gotta pay rent now," and it's not high, right? It's just the fact that planting for the past 3-4 years, I've had no overhead cost, and now I have to be somewhat conscious of the cost, even though it's reasonable and affordable, but it's reality. The fact that paying rent does include, in my case, all utilities and expenses for the worship space, for the office space, etc. I mean, that's a part of planting and being accountable for that type of stuff. I mean, how do we begin to support planters towards learning how to manage the Lord's church? And I'll throw in there, and maybe this is a moment where we just bring out our Bibles, but even when Paul talks about it too, I mean, how do we begin to have that conversation and push planters towards being more business oriented minded?
Well, I think everyone has this idea, even though it's not true. We kind of have this idea that there's an organization out there that will connect with my vision so much that they'll pay for it. And, it's not reality in church planting. Maybe there was a day when organizations had a lot of money.
Yeah.
And they would just throw your full salary out there and say, here, we'll care for you. But that wasn't true when I started 20 years ago. I mean, we basically had 3 years. So they said, you'll get, well, for me, it was 14,000 year one, 8,000 year two, 5,000 year three, and you're on your own.
Assuming you're growing and sustainable.
Assuming you're growing and sustainable. And so, planters have to come in, especially in places like New England, where, it's going to be expensive. It's expensive everywhere, but it's expensive here in different ways.
Yeah.
And so you have to face these challenges. And people coming in, they're not, unless you're attracting Christians who already get the whole giving idea, you're asking people to go from giving, an occasional $5 to, this fund or that fund, to saying, we're a part of this organization and you need to support it, and God wants you to, you go through the whole theology of what giving is all about, and then, that's not going to happen overnight. I mean, I think they say the typical person, it takes like a year for them to be a part of your, like a typical person, like a year before they're actually giving any regular amount to your church if they're not churched. If they're coming in and, a Christian will come in and realize, oh, okay, I'm supposed to give. And so that's a blessing. But, as a church planter, when church people come in, that poses its own unique challenges. It may come with some benefits, but it poses its own challenges.
Yes.
So, the only thing I can say is I don't know of a lot of business classes for pastors. It's just read. You just have to read, and you have to, don't be afraid to talk to people. I mean, one of the most helpful things I did was I got involved with the Rotary Club, and it's all businessmen, a lot of them business owners, business leaders, and they love to tell you what they do and how they do it and give you advice. And so that was very helpful. And the other thing is to read, and, and everybody's story is unique, so it's hard. One of the things that I think is also hard about church planting is the guys who are, and we've talked about this, the guys who write the books, I love, but they're all like that unique success story that has this big story to tell.
And it has all the support in the base.
Yeah.
So that leads me to, and we're definitely off script for a while, so this conversation fascinates me. I thought moving here that I was going to move here and have a church that would support me and my family. That was the plan, dude. Right. To just quit my job and leave in Philadelphia and just do ministry full time. And we just live off the ministry, and our minds were geared towards that. We were ready mentally, emotionally, spiritually for that. And it didn't work out that way. But on top of that, I think the New England reality of if you don't move here with a team or tons of financial support from a mother church elsewhere who's going to support you for a reasonable amount of time, and reasonable is subjective, and in an issue in New England, then you're going to have to, I don't even know if bivocational is even, the path. You're going to have to work, a regular job and figure out how to balance a 9 to 5 with your church work. And I think that was like just one of those, okay, God, I see type of moments, which then forced me to think about my career differently, because my career was already going down the path where it is now, working in a nonprofit space and, having certain levels of responsibilities at, nonprofits that I worked at, which I'm grateful and thankful for. But besides the secular accolades that come along with, the responsibilities I have, the jobs that I've maintained in Connecticut have been so kingdom connected because they've been in places where, first of all, I'm called to Connecticut, but it's been targeted in places where God has called me to pastor, which has been like a huge blessing. So it's not like I work in another town and then I, pastor here. Like a lot of my work collides with my ministry.